much, Bob. And also my congratulations to Maleeha for compiling an excellent volume. I've read it as well, and I did not do it at gunpoint. The role of religion in Pakistan's development and evolution. And religion, in my view, has been used in Pakistan for many different reasons. And the two that I'm going to focus on in particular are, one, nation building, and two is the national security debates in Pakistan. In terms of nation building, I think it's clear to many of us who followed Pakistan's history that religion has always been a very important theme, all the way back to the debate about independence and the struggle for the constitutional rights of Muslims that eventually became a struggle for a separate Pakistan. As the many leaders that came through in the early years wrestled with, there was an imperative to create a national identity for a very fractured state. And the one clearest expression of that actually comes in an article that Ayub Khan, who was a former general president of Pakistan, wrote in Foreign Affairs of all forums. And that article was published in 1960. And let me just very briefly read to you an excerpt from that that'll really make this point clear of how the nation has used religion as a top-down way of creating a national narrative. So in his article, Ayub Khan talks about, quote, liberating the basic concept of our ideology from the dust of vagueness. And he goes on to say, in talking about a need for a people to have an ideology, that, quote, they will have tremendous power of cohesion and resistance. Such an ideology with us is obviously Islam. It was on that basis that we fought for and got Pakistan, but having got it, we failed to define the ideology in a simple and understandable form. Well, I would argue that Pakistan subsequently, or at least some elements in Pakistan, did succeed in defining it in a simple and understandable form, but not one that I necessarily agree with. And again, the point is that the goal that these leaders were wrestling with was, how do we unify this nation? How do we bring it together? But the execution was misguided in my view. So for example, this has been written a lot about by the education sector. If we look at the history of Pakistan as it was taught, it was less about a product of a Hindu-Muslim heritage, which is the reality of the subcontinent. It was less about, as I mentioned, a struggle post-colonial period for the constitutional rights of Muslims. Instead, it became about this inexorable culmination of Islam's arrival in the subcontinent, manifested itself in the form of Pakistan. So we can see this exercise of religion as an ideology to bring a nation together, and the effects of that, obviously, we see today as well. The second way in which religion has been used by the state has very much informed the national security considerations. And again, over here, this is very well known, obviously during the Zia period, but even further back, the state has often used these notions of jihad to bless both conventional forces and proxy as well, and again, rallied the country and rallied against enemies on the basis of religion. And this securitizing of religion has obviously had a significant blowback for Pakistan today that we're talking about in this town, and when Pakistan is feeling it visibly. But more than the blowback, I want to come back to the point of the narrative. Many of these non-state actors have, in essence, hijacked that Islamic narrative and are using it against the state. So for example, there are groups that say that the Pakistani state is in itself un-Islamic and must be attacked for siding with the United States. Or you have groups waving the banner of Islam, saying that it is an antidote to Pakistan's problems, or the weaknesses in governance can only be addressed by becoming a more pure Islamic society. So we can see how the state, even though it started off with this narrative of national security in the guise of religion, is losing control of that narrative, in my view, as well. But even as there have been these expressions, there have been many others that almost sort of countering it throughout Pakistan's history. Going back to the original statesman of Pakistan, so to speak, Quaid-e-Azam Muhammad Ali Jinnah, I highly recommend to you the chapter by Akbar Ahmed in this book, where he talks about Jinnah's relevance today and his vision for plurality and the role of religion in the state and how that balance was to be struck. But let me talk briefly about a couple of other points that might not be as well known in this counter-narrative, so to speak. One of the most powerful reports that I think that came out in the sort of the history of Pakistan, and this was in the context of the riots against the Ahmadiyas in 1954, was the Munir Report. And it's a document that many people don't know about, but in my view, it's one of the most far-sighted documents ever issued in Pakistan, warning against the state getting involved in saying who's Islamic, who's not, who's a Muslim, who's not. And the report, which I commend you to read, basically makes the argument that this isn't the business of the state, and if we get into this business of a national ideology and nationalizing religion in this way, it's a very slippery slope, and I think we've seen that to be the case. But aside from these early statements, let's come to where we are today, and let me pick up on a theme that Maleeha has made about a weak state, strong society. Well, civil society today in Pakistan is playing an extremely dynamic role in offering up a different narrative, and I don't mean it in sort of a very synthesized, coherent manner. I mean bits and pieces. So we know about the incident where the flogging in Swat, which was the media broadly broadcast, resulted in a sort of a movement against what was viewed as sort of an un-Islamic application of criminal law, even though the people who did it said they were doing it in the name of religion. We see movies and music throughout both of them. We see these expressions of a different narrative. The movie Khuda Ke Liye, which many of you may have seen, again, it comes from a particular segment of society, but it's an important expression of the fatigue with the radicalization debate. And for those of you who actually have taken the time to see the movie and hear the song, the title track talks about this point that, God is not just yours. And I think that's a broader point that many people in Pakistan are saying, that there's no monopoly over religion that a certain group of people have just because they have a beard or they speak Arabic, for that matter. Another expression I would point to is a campaign that was going on in Pakistan the last few years called Ye Hum Nahi, This Is Not Us. Now, this campaign was essentially a number of celebrities in Pakistan, their faces plastered on billboards in the major cities, and basically saying that look at all of these things that are going on around us, suicide bombing, extremism, terrorism, this is not who we are. And now, again, these are just expressions of what some might dismiss as well, this is just the liberal society doing its things. But even among the religious establishment, there have been movements, there have been expressions, there have been outright condemnations of suicide bombing. Just last month in Lahore, there was a convention bringing together about 250 clerics from 18 different countries saying just that suicide bombing is un-Islamic. So what does all of this mean? What I'm trying to get at here is that civil society in Pakistan is offering up bits and pieces of what I'm going to somewhat provocatively call an ideological resistance, a counter-narrative, so to speak. And that, I think, is a very, very valuable thing. But as we think about how this narrative develops, I'm going to leave you with two takeaway points. The first is this debate over the role of religion in Pakistan is not something that began when General Zia came to power. The analysis usually begins that once Zia came, extremism began and everything went haywire. No, the seeds of this debate about what is the role of Islam in society go back to the very founding of the country. That debate over the idea of Pakistan was contested then, and it's going to continue to be contested. But how do we analyze this debate proceeding? Well, I would argue that whereas in the past, the narrative of Pakistan, this Islamic narrative was imposed top-down, an Ayub Khan writing in Foreign Affairs saying this is the ideology the state must develop. Now I think with the role of civil society, with the confluence of technology and the sort of youth purge we see in Pakistan, we may see these bits and pieces of expression coming together and offering up a bottom-up narrative. And that narrative might be one that many of us agree with or disagree with, but it's something to think about, is where is the narrative coming from and how is it getting strung together? And I would just add in closing that this issue of narrative might seem vague and amorphous to many of you when many of us in this town are focused on the fundamentals, governance, security, education. But it is worth it every now and then to step back and think of the overall orientation of a country. And here's another thing. Here's a country that's thinking about the exact same issue, the United States. In a report that the Woodrow Wilson Center just published, a very interesting essay under the name of Mr. Y, kind of picking up on the point of George Kennan's essay under the pseudonym X. This essay makes the exact same point for the United States. It says, we have a national security strategy, but that's written by specialists for specialists. What we need is a narrative, a national security narrative about what does the United States stand for today, where are we going in the world. Now in Pakistan's case, it's not a national security narrative, it's almost more of a domestic narrative. And that's what I'm arguing for, that civil society might be able to play a role in pulling that together. So with that, thank you again, Maleeha.